I found out at 8:32 a.m. on a Tuesday when my rent check bounced. Not because I was broke. I had $65,000 in savings, 5 years of 12-hour nursing shifts, and $20 grocery budgets to build something my parents had never been able to give me: security. Except when I called the bank, my account showed a balance of $0.17. There was a large withdrawal yesterday, the representative explained in that practiced voice banks use when delivering financial devastation, authorized by the secondary account holder. Your father, Clark, Robert J. My father, who'd helped me open the account when I was 22 because family should help family build their future. Who'd praised my discipline, called me responsible, said he was proud of how I'd saved every overtime dollar while my friends were buying cars they couldn't afford and taking vacations on credit cards. Who'd apparently been planning to steal my entire life's work the moment I'd been stupid enough to trust him with access to it. The confrontation happened that afternoon in his living room, where he sat in his recliner like a judge, delivering a verdict instead of a thief caught red-handed. It's not stealing when it's family, he said, his voice carrying the same authority he'd used to explain why I should be grateful for his parenting when I was growing up. I raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe me more than money can repay. $65,000. Gone to pay gambling debts he'd hidden from our family for months, transferred from my account to his creditors while I was pulling double shifts to save for the house I'd never be able to buy now. You should be grateful I'm only taking what's mine, he continued, as if theft could be rebramed as collection on a debt I'd never agreed to owe. After everything I've sacrificed for you, that's when I realized this wasn't desperation. This was entitlement. And I was about to show him exactly what his sacrifice had been worth. My name is Lucy Clark, 32 now, but at 21, opening that savings account felt like opening a door to a future where I'd never have to worry about money the way my parents did, where financial security would be something I controlled instead of something that controlled me. The account started with $300, babysitting money from high school, tips from my weekend job at Tony's Diner, birthday checks from grandparents who believed $20 bills could accumulate into something meaningful if you had the discipline to resist spending them on things that felt necessary but weren't essential. Every deposit was a small victory. Every balance increase represented hours of saying no to things other people my age took for granted. No spring break trips to Cancun. No new clothes unless the old ones had holes that couldn't be fixed. No dinners out unless someone else was paying, because every dollar saved was a dollar invested in a version of myself who wouldn't have to check bank balances before buying groceries. Dad had been proud when I'd asked him to be the secondary account holder. Smart girl, he'd said, his voice carrying the approval I'd spent my childhood trying to earn. Family should help family build their future. I'll keep an eye on it, make sure nobody tries to take advantage of you. At 19, those words had felt like protection. By 32, I understood they'd been a threat disguised as paternal concern. Growing up in our split-level house in suburban Cleveland, our family dynamic had been painted in familiar colors. Dad was the life of every party, the guy who picked up dinner checks for friends and coworkers, the man everyone called dependable when they needed someone to fix their car or help them move. His laughter-filled rooms and his handshake sealed deals that neighbors and relatives still talked about years later. Mom was the quiet counterbalance, conflict-averse in ways that kept our household peaceful but left problems unresolved until they grew too large to ignore. She smoothed over Dad's occasional financial miscalculations, covered for his tendency to overspend on other people's problems, maintained the appearance of stability, even when bills went unpaid and credit cards reached limits that required creative juggling to manage. And me? I was the dutiful daughter who never caused trouble, never asked for money for school trips or designer clothes, never complained when family vacations were canceled because of unexpected expenses that were never fully explained. I learned early that being low maintenance was a virtue in our household, that requiring less meant being valued more. The savings account became my rebellion against family financial chaos disguised as generosity. Every $1,000 accumulated felt like evidence that I was different from parents who meant well but spent emotionally, who helped everyone except themselves, who'd taught me about responsibility through lectures rather than example. By 25, I'd saved $30,000. By 28, it had grown to $50,000. By 31, $65,000 represented 5 years of 12-hour nursing shifts, overtime pay that went directly to savings instead of lifestyle inflation, A future that belonged entirely to me because I'd earned every dollar through work that left my hands raw from constant sanitizing, and my feet aching from standing on hospital floors that never seemed to soften. That money wasn't just financial security. It was proof that the daughter who'd grown up watching her parents struggle with money they'd earned but never managed to keep could break cycles that had defined previous generations, could build something that would last longer than the next unexpected expense or generous impulse that left checking accounts empty and credit cards maxed. The laptop screen glowed in my apartment's darkness that Tuesday morning when I logged into online banking, expecting to see the familiar comfort of $65,000 plus whatever interest had accumulated. Overnight. Instead, the balance read $0.17, like a slap delivered through fiber optic cables. Every babysitting shift from high school, every double at Tony's diner during college, every birthday check I'd deposited instead of spent, every vacation I'd skipped, every dinner I'd cooked instead of ordered, every sacrifice I'd made to build something that couldn't be taken away from me, gone in a single electronic transfer I'd never authorized but had somehow been powerless to prevent. But what hurt worse than the empty account was understanding that the man who'd taught me about fiscal responsibility through years of lectures about spending wisely and saving consistently had been planning to steal my life's work the moment I'd been naive enough to trust him with access to it. The family reunion was supposed to be about Grandma's 80th birthday, not my father's public execution of my character in front of 40 relatives who'd driven from 3 states to celebrate 8 decades of someone who'd actually earned their respect. Mom had strung fairy lights across the backyard, their warm glow creating the kind of magical atmosphere that makes family gatherings feel like Norman Rockwell paintings, instead of the dysfunctional reality shows they usually resembled. Sheet cake from the grocery store bakery, champagne flutes filled with sparkling cider for the kids and Prosecco for the adults, folding tables covered with plastic tablecloths that had seen better decades but still managed to make everything look festive. 3 weeks had passed since I'd discovered my empty savings account, 3 weeks of sleepless nights and confrontations that had gone nowhere because Dad had perfected the art of reframing theft as family obligation, stealing as sacrifice, betrayal as misunderstood generosity that ungrateful children couldn't appreciate. I'd been avoiding family events since the money disappeared, but Grandma's 80th wasn't something you could skip without creating more drama than attendance would generate. So I'd driven the 2 hours from my apartment to our childhood suburb, hoping to survive a few hours of small talk and sheet cake without anyone mentioning the elephant in the backyard that had been trampling our family dynamic since Tuesday morning when my rent check bounced. Dad had been holding court all afternoon, regaling cousins and neighbors with stories about his latest construction projects, his golf game, his opinions about everything from local politics to gas prices. Classic dad behavior, charming, engaging, the kind of natural performer who could make insurance sales sound like entertainment and convince people that his problems were actually opportunities in disguise. But when he clinked his champagne flute with a butter knife, calling for attention like he was making an important announcement at a wedding reception, I felt my stomach drop with the recognition that whatever came next was going to change everything. "A toast," he announced, his voice carrying across conversations that had been humming pleasantly until that moment, to family, to being there for each other when times get tough. 40 faces turned toward him with the expectant attention that family patriarchs command at gatherings where their approval determines whether stories get retold at future events. Uncles who'd borrowed money from him over the years, cousins who remembered him helping with car payments and medical bills, relatives who'd never questioned whether his generosity came from his own resources or someone else's. My wine glass shook in my hand as I watched him scan the crowd with the satisfied expression of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks, who'd scripted his words to maximum effect. "Some of you might have heard that I've had some financial difficulties recently," he continued, his tone suggesting that discussing money at family gatherings was slightly distasteful but necessary under the circumstances. "Business has been slow. Bills have been piling up, and things got pretty tight for a while there." Murmurs of sympathy rippled through relatives who'd survived their own financial struggles, who understood that construction work was seasonal and unpredictable, who'd watched him help other people during their difficult periods and felt he deserved the same consideration. "But family comes first," Dad said, his voice gaining strength as he approached whatever point he'd been building toward. And when push came to shove, Lucy stepped up to help her old man out. used her savings to keep us afloat. Used, not stole, not took without permission. Used, like I'd participated in a decision that had actually been theft disguised as emergency assistance. $65,000, he continued, his voice carrying pride instead of shame, accomplishment instead of guilt. That's what family means, being willing to sacrifice for each other when times get tough. The number hit the gathering like a physical force, gasps from cousins who'd never seen that much money at one time, an aunt whispering to her husband, 65,000? That's more than we make in a year. Relatives calculating how long it would take them to save such an amount, how many sacrifices would be required, how much trust would be necessary to hand over a small fortune to help someone else's problems. My mother stared at her paper plate like it contained answers to questions she'd been avoiding, her face wearing the expression of someone who'd known this conversation was coming but had hoped it could be postponed indefinitely. But instead of being grateful that we kept the family business alive, Dad's voice carried disappointment that felt practiced, rehearsed, designed for maximum emotional impact. Lucy's been sulking like I did her some kind of wrong, acting like family helping family is somehow a bad thing. Ungrateful. The word didn't need to be spoken because it hung in the humid summer air like smoke from a fire that had been deliberately set. He'd painted me as the selfish daughter who couldn't appreciate sacrifice, who'd chosen money over family loyalty, who'd made her father's financial survival about her own petty concerns instead of recognizing the honor of being needed. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment, relatives trying to reconcile the Lucy they'd known, responsible, hard-working, never caused trouble, with the ungrateful daughter who apparently couldn't appreciate the privilege of funding someone else's financial mistakes. I sat there holding a champagne flute that contained $3 worth of Prosecco, wearing a dress that had cost $40 at Target, driving a Honda Civic with 160,000 miles on it, being characterized as someone whose expectations were unreasonable and whose financial boundaries were evidence of selfishness rather than self-preservation. Shame, I learned that afternoon, is heavier when it's public. Private humiliation you can process alone, work through in therapy, discuss with friends who understand context and nuance. Public shame gets witnessed by people whose opinions matter, recorded in family memories that get retold at future gatherings, embedded in narratives that follow you to weddings and funerals and holiday dinners for decades afterward. He hadn't just stolen my money. He'd rewritten the story to make theft look like generosity, betrayal look like sacrifice, my financial boundaries look like ingratitude that reflected poorly on my character rather than his actions. Sitting in that backyard surrounded by fairy lights that had been meant to create magic instead of illuminate my character assassination, I realized that fighting back would require more than demanding my money back. It would require proving that the daughter he'd labeled ungrateful was actually the only family member responsible enough to deserve the savings he'd stolen, generous enough to have earned the money he'd taken, and strong enough to rebuild from the wreckage of his public betrayal. The humid summer air wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, carrying the weight of 40 relatives' disappointment and one father's masterful manipulation of family dynamics that had taken 32 years to perfect. I left the reunion early, walking to my Honda Civic through a gauntlet of relatives whose stares burned my back like cigarette tips pressed against skin. Behind me, Dad's laughter carried across the backyard as he regaled cousins with another story, his voice booming with the confidence of someone who'd just convinced 40 people that theft was generosity and betrayal was sacrifice. He went home that night with applause still ringing in his ears, surrounded by family members who'd congratulated him on raising such a responsible daughter, while simultaneously expressing disappointment that she couldn't appreciate the honor of being financially exploited by her own by-feared father. I went home to a studio apartment with water-stained ceilings and a mattress on the floor, the kind of place you rent when $65,000 disappears overnight, and you discover that starting over at 32 feels a lot like being 22, except without the optimism that had made poverty feel temporary the first time around. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing about money, kids crying past bedtime, televisions turned up too loud to mask conversations about bills that couldn't be paid, and dreams that had been deferred until further notice. My apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been renovated exactly once since it was built in 1987, upstairs that creaked like they were protesting every footstep. But it was mine. Paid for with nursing shift money that my father couldn't access, couldn't steal, couldn't justify taking because he'd taught me about family obligation through lectures that had never mentioned his gambling addiction or my role as his unwitting financial sponsor. The job hunt began immediately because starting over meant more than finding a cheaper place to live. It meant rebuilding everything Dad had destroyed when he'd decided that my life's work belonged to him. Hospitals were hiring, but the good positions required references from supervisors who knew you could be trusted with responsibility, who'd seen you handle pressure without falling apart. My previous hospital job had ended when I'd moved closer to home to help with what Dad had called temporary family difficulties that had turned out to be his gambling debts, masquerading as business emergencies that required family solutions. Now I was starting over in a new city where nobody knew my work history, my reliability, or my qualifications beyond what could be documented on applications that made 5 years of nursing experience look like data points instead of proof that I'd never been the irresponsible daughter Dad had portrayed me as. Mickey's Diner on Broad Street hired me for the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., serving coffee and eggs to people whose schedules didn't align with daylight hours. Truckers heading cross-country, hospital workers getting off third shift, insomniacs who needed somewhere to sit when their apartments felt too small to contain their problems. My feet blistered in shoes I'd bought at Payless because replacing nursing clogs wasn't in a budget that had been calculated down to the dollar after Dad's theft had eliminated any margin for unexpected expenses. The work was honest but hard, carrying plates that weighed more than they should and listening to customers who needed someone to talk to more than they needed perfectly prepared food. 8-hour shifts that paid what I used to make in 2 hours as a registered nurse. But money was money and progress was progress, and bills got paid regardless of whether the work felt worthy of my education or experience. During the day, I studied for my nurse practitioner program applications, using public library computers because internet service wasn't something my new budget could accommodate. The fluorescent lights flickered like strobe effects, casting unstable shadows across textbooks I'd bought, used from students who'd finished degrees I was still fighting to afford. The library became my office, my study hall, my refuge from an apartment that smelled like other people's cooking, and echoed with sounds that reminded me daily that I was starting over in circumstances I'd never planned to face again. Homeless people used the bathroom to wash, and I understood for the first time that my situation wasn't so different from theirs. We were all people whose previous lives had been interrupted by circumstances beyond our control, trying to rebuild with resources that never felt adequate. Canned soup became my primary food group because it was cheap, filling, and could be heated with a hot plate that had been included with my furnished apartment rental. Chicken noodle for variety, tomato for comfort, vegetable when I felt guilty about nutrition. Meals eaten standing in a kitchen that was smaller than most people's pantries, looking out windows that faced brick walls instead of possibilities. Friends invited me to dinner, to movies, to weekend trips I couldn't afford even when they offered to pay, because charity from people who'd never had their savings stolen felt different than charity from family members who'd enabled the stealing. I made excuses that became easier with practice, declined invitations that became less frequent as months passed, and people moved on to friendships that required less accommodation. But late at night, sitting on that mattress, surrounded by textbooks and application forms for graduate programs that felt impossible but necessary, I'd think about Dad's toast and the relatives who'd nodded along with his narrative about ungrateful daughters who couldn't appreciate family sacrifice. They can call me ungrateful, I'd whisper to water-stained ceilings that had witnessed previous tenants' struggles and would witness future ones after I'd moved on to something better. They can take my savings, but they will never own my future. The words became my mantra during 16-hour days when exhaustion felt like drowning and starting over felt like punishment for trusting someone who'd spent 32 years earning that trust so he could weaponize it when convenient. Every night shift survived, every library hour logged. Every canned soup, dinner eaten standing up was evidence that the daughter Dad had labeled ungrateful was actually grateful enough to rebuild without asking family members who'd enabled her exploitation to fund her recovery from their betrayal. When the world thinks you're ungrateful, the only answer is to create a life so undeniable that no one's opinion matters. Not because their judgment stops hurting, but because your accomplishments start speaking louder than their accusations. I was building something Dad couldn't steal because it existed in my experience rather than my bank account, in my qualifications rather than my inheritance, in my character rather than my family's version of what my character should be. The woman he'd robbed to pay gambling debts was becoming someone who couldn't be robbed because everything valuable about her was carried inside her head, her hands, her refusal to let other people's theft determine her worth or limit her possibilities. At 32, starting over felt like the most grateful thing I'd ever done, grateful that his betrayal had taught me the difference between family love and family exploitation, between being needed and being used, between supporting people who supported you back and funding people who saw your resources as their right, rather than your accomplishment. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Rebuilding a life that someone else has demolished takes time measured in years rather than months, progress calculated in small victories that accumulate into something larger than the sum of their individual parts. Every sacrifice became a stepping stone toward something Dad couldn't steal because it existed in my skills rather than my bank account, in my reputation rather than my inheritance, in my ability to create value rather than my capacity to store money other people could access when convenient. By 26, I'd saved enough to move out of the studio apartment with water-stained ceilings into a one-bedroom place in a neighborhood where gunshots were infrequent enough to not require mental mapping of safe routes to the parking lot. The lease was signed in my name alone, no co-signers, no secondary account holders, no family members with access to anything that belonged to me. The walls were covered with sticky notes, goals written in handwriting that had become steadier as my life had become more stable. Save $10 Kelvins by December. Apply to marketing certificate program. Build client base to 15 accounts. Prove Dad wrong about everything. That last one wasn't originally part of my goal-setting strategy, but it had become the underlying motivation that powered everything else. Every achievement was evidence that the daughter he'd labeled ungrateful was actually more grateful for opportunities than he'd ever been for the financial sacrifices his theft had required. The marketing agency started at my kitchen table, a fold-out card table that had come with my furnished apartment, wobbly enough that typing required careful weight distribution to prevent laptop-induced earthquakes. But it was stable enough to hold business plans drafted during midnight brainstorming sessions when diner shift exhaustion mixed with possibility in ways that made impossible dreams feel achievable. My first client was Rosa Martinez, who owned 3 laundromats in South Philadelphia and needed someone who understood both small business economics and communities where every dollar mattered. She paid me $400 to redesign her marketing strategy, more money than I'd made in tips during my best week at Mickey's Diner. "You get it," she told me after I'd presented campaigns that focused on value rather than luxury, convenience rather than status, community connection rather than generic appeals that could have been written for businesses in any city. "You understand what it's like to build something from nothing." Building something from nothing had become my specialty, not because I'd chosen it as a business model, but because Dad's theft had forced me to develop expertise in creating value from circumstances that other people would have considered starting points rather than advantages. By 28, Clark Marketing Solutions occupied office space in a converted warehouse that had been subdivided into units small businesses could actually afford. My desk faced windows that looked out over the Delaware River, water that moved constantly toward destinations I couldn't see but trusted existed because rivers don't flow in circles, they find oceans. The business grew because word spreads quickly in communities of people who've had to rebuild from setbacks they didn't create, entrepreneurs who'd survived divorces that had cost them half their assets, small business owners who'd weathered recessions that had eliminated their customer base, people who understood that starting over wasn't failure. It was resilience that had been tested by circumstances beyond their control. My clients weren't Fortune 500 companies with unlimited budgets for experimental campaigns that might generate marginal improvements to already successful operations. They were people who needed marketing strategies that actually worked because failure meant losing everything they'd sacrificed to build, not just disappointing shareholders who'd never missed meals to fund business development. By 30, I'd hired 6 employees who'd been hired based on ability rather than connections, work ethic rather than family relationships, and results rather than potential that had never been translated into actual achievement. The office buzzed with conversations about client success stories, campaign results that had exceeded projections, small businesses that had grown into medium businesses because someone had finally understood how to reach customers who'd been waiting to be reached. By 31, the contract that changed everything arrived through email at 3:40 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday that had started like any other day of building something that couldn't be stolen because it existed in relationships rather than accounts, reputation rather than bank balances. Meridian Healthcare needed a marketing firm that could help them launch a patient advocacy program in 12 cities, targeting families who'd been failed by healthcare systems that prioritized profits over people. The contract was worth $250,000 over 18 months, more money than I'd lost when Dad had emptied my savings account, more than I'd made during all my years of nursing combined. I framed that contract and hung it on my office wall where a diploma might have been displayed. If diplomas had been capable of representing the kind of education that comes from having your life's work stolen by someone who'd taught you about financial responsibility through lectures while practicing financial irresponsibility through theft, the success wasn't about replacing what had been stolen. Money is replaceable. Trust, family relationships, and faith in people who raise you to believe that love is unconditional are more difficult to repair. But success was about proving that my worth couldn't be emptied by anyone else's choices, that the value I could create was limited only by my willingness to work, rather than other people's willingness to support me. Standing in that office, overlooking water that moved toward oceans I'd never seen, holding contracts worth more than Dad had stolen, employing people whose livelihoods depended on my ability to generate results rather than my ability to enable other people's financial mistakes, I realized something that would have been impossible to understand from that mattress on the floor where I'd whispered promises to water-stained ceilings. The insult ungrateful no longer stung. Not because I'd developed thicker skin or learned to ignore family members who'd chosen to believe theft was generosity, but because I'd learned to be grateful to myself. Grateful for resilience that had been tested by betrayal and proven stronger than the people who'd tested it. Grateful for skills that couldn't be stolen because they existed in my experience rather than my bank account. Every client success story was proof that the daughter who'd been labeled ungrateful was actually more grateful for opportunities than family members who'd taken opportunities for granted, more appreciative of trust than people who'd weaponized trust when convenient, more deserving of financial security than those who'd justified stealing it. Dad's theft had taught me the difference between being grateful for what other people give you and being grateful for what you're capable of building when they stop giving it. Between appreciating support and appreciating your own strength when support gets withdrawn. Between valuing family money and valuing the family you choose to build with people who see your worth instead of your resources. The woman he'd robbed to pay gambling debts had become someone who couldn't be robbed because everything valuable about her lived in relationships she'd earned, skills she'd developed, and character she'd proven through surviving his betrayal without becoming someone who betrayed others. At 31, sitting in an office I'd bought with money I'd earned through work that mattered to people who mattered to me, I understood that gratitude isn't about accepting what people choose to give you. It's about appreciating what you're strong enough to build when they choose to take it away. 5 years later, at Uncle Mike's retirement party, the family gathering felt smaller than I remembered. Fewer cousins, some had moved away, others had drifted into adult lives that made weekend drives for family obligations feel less mandatory. More gray hair around tables that still used the same plastic tablecloths from my childhood. Conversations that focused on grandchildren and health problems instead of career achievements and future plans. Dad looked different. Not just older, but worn down in ways that 5 years shouldn't have aged someone. The booming confidence that had characterized his toast about ungrateful daughters was gone, replaced by something that looked like exhaustion disguised as socializing. I was talking with my cousin Sarah when I felt his approach, that particular attention that comes when someone needs something from you but hasn't figured out how to ask for it yet. He waited until Sarah excused herself to get dessert before moving closer, his smile carrying the careful calculation of someone testing receptiveness. "Lucy," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered. "You look successful. Business is good?" The question felt loaded, like information gathering rather than paternal interest. But I'd learned that responding to dysfunction with matching dysfunction only creates more problems, so I answered honestly. "Business is very good. We just landed our biggest contract last month." His eyes lit up with interest that felt calculating rather than proud. "That's great. Really great. I always knew you'd do well for yourself." Always knew. The man who'd called me ungrateful for objecting to theft was now rewriting history, suggesting he'd been confident in my potential all along. "Lucy, I was wondering if we could talk privately for a minute." We walked outside to the parking lot where harsh fluorescent lights made everything look like a crime scene. He glanced around nervously before speaking, like he was about to confess something instead of ask for something. "I'm in a tough spot," he said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Business has been slow, bills are piling up. I could really use some help getting back on my feet." Back on his feet. Like the gambling debts that had destroyed his business and cost him his house, were a temporary setback rather than ongoing addiction that had been damaging our family for years. "I know things got complicated between us after that situation with your savings," he continued, reframing theft as complications, betrayal as situations that time had somehow resolved. "But family is family, and I was hoping you might be able to help me out with a loan, just until things turn around." The same man who'd emptied my savings account was now asking to tap into the success I'd built from the wreckage of his theft. Requesting access to resources I'd accumulated by learning to trust only myself with anything that mattered. "How much?" I asked, not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to understand the scope of problems that had driven him to ask help from the daughter he'd publicly humiliated. "50,000 would really help," he said hopefully. "I know it's a lot, but your business is doing well, and I promise I'd pay you back once things stabilize." I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope I'd been carrying. Knowing conversations like this were inevitable when families include people whose problems require ongoing financial solutions that other family members are expected to provide. "I want to show you something," I said, handing him the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of my $250,000 contract, the one that had proved everything he'd said about my character was wrong, evidence of success built from the foundation of his betrayal. He unfolded the paper under parking lot lights, his face cycling through expressions as he processed numbers that represented more money than he'd ever imagined attached to my name. "This is what I built after you took everything," I said, my voice steady with 5 years of therapy and learning to value myself based on what I could create, rather than what family members thought I deserved. "You once called me ungrateful in front of 40 relatives, but gratitude doesn't mean letting you steal from me twice." The silence stretched between us, heavy with recognition that the daughter he'd exploited had become someone who couldn't be exploited anymore. "Lucy," he started, something like shame finally creeping into his voice. "Thank you," I interrupted, taking back the contract that represented everything he'd been wrong about. "Thank you for showing me who you really are. Thank you for teaching me that my worth isn't determined by your opinion. And thank you for forcing me to become someone strong enough to say no." I walked to my car, leaving him standing under fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. The drive home took me past neighborhoods where I'd lived during the rebuilding years. Apartments that had sheltered me while I'd learned to trust myself more than family members who confused my resources with their rights. In the rearview mirror, the community center grew smaller until it disappeared, taking with it the last remnants of believing that family relationships were worth maintaining when they required accepting exploitation as the price of admission. At home, in the house I'd bought with money earned through work that mattered to people who respected my expertise, I sat looking at contracts from clients who valued my ability to solve their problems rather than expecting me to fund problems I hadn't created. The woman he'd robbed had become someone who couldn't be robbed again, not because of better bank security, but because she'd learned that the most valuable things in life can't be stolen by people whose love comes with conditions. He'd emptied my savings. He'd called me ungrateful. He'd justified theft as family obligation. But the life I'd built since then was proof that the only thing I'd never be again was his victim. Some lessons cost $65,000. Some families cost more than money can measure. Some gratitude means being grateful. You're strong enough to walk away from people who mistake your love for their license to take whatever they want. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life built without his help or approval, I understood that real gratitude isn't about accepting what people choose to give you. It's about appreciating what you're capable of building when you finally stop letting them take it away. If Lucy's story hit you where it hurts, if you've ever been called ungrateful for having boundaries with family members who exploit your generosity, if you've ever had to rebuild after someone you trusted took what you worked for, you know why this story matters. This isn't just about stolen money or family dysfunction. It's about recognizing that gratitude doesn't mean accepting financial exploitation. It's about understanding that sometimes the people who call you ungrateful are the ones who feel entitled to what you've earned through your own sacrifice. Hit that like button if you've ever had to choose between family peace and financial boundaries. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week, we're sharing another story about someone who learned that protecting yourself from toxic family isn't selfish, it's necessary. Share this with someone who needs to remember that being called ungrateful by people who exploit your generosity doesn't make you ungrateful, it makes them entitled. Comment below and tell me about a time when you had to set financial boundaries with family members who confused your resources with their rights. Remember, you don't owe anyone access to your success just because they share your DNA. You don't have to fund other people's problems to prove you love them. And you definitely don't need to accept being called ungrateful by people whose definition of gratitude requires your continued exploitation. Lucy's father called her ungrateful for objecting to theft. But real gratitude means appreciating what you build when you finally stop letting others take it away.